Welcome to the region's only public safety radio talk show. It's time again for the Sheriff's Report, your weekly radio call from Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich, now in its third year on the air.
Radio base to the Sheriff. Come in, Sheriff.
Well, good afternoon, folks. Morning, depends on when you're listening or watching this program. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich, and today we're going to cover a topic that has kind of dominated a little bit of the news here locally for the last couple of weeks. Quite frankly, it dives into a history of the area, and the title of this show is For the Soul of America. It's a look at white supremacy and the white nationalist movement here in the Spokane region. Over the last several years, I've done 2 town halls in reference to this particular topic. I've pointed out how these people with this ideology have tried to do some very nefarious things within the Spokane County region, and it's much deeper than just the Spokane County region. It's very much eastern Washington, northern Idaho based. And to do this segment, I thought the best person to have this talk with was somebody who actually grew up in that movement, in the white supremacist movement, in the white nationalist movement. In studio with me today is former Washington State Senator, John Smith. And John has a fairly extensive knowledge, personal knowledge, of just how deeply rooted this is in our area, just how bad these people can be. And John, I really appreciate you stepping forward and being willing to come on the program and talk about that. But before we go much further, there's a couple of house cleaning things I think that me and you have to do.
Yep.
You know, because your detractors, my detractors are all going to go, wait a minute, time out. He's a disgraced Washington State senator. He lost a seat because, quite frankly, the same people we're going to be talking about tagged you as a white supremacist, and you lost that seat because of that label, and they're going to say sour grapes. How do you respond to that?
Well, I was reminded this week of Winston Churchill talking about truth and how it can be ignored, it can be rejected, it can be misrepresented, but in the end, it still exists. And so the truth is, I did grow up in a white supremacist family. That was the environment that I lived in. I spent 3 hours with one of the Spokesman Review's reporters detailing how bad it was, how glad I was not to be there. And somehow, the article that came out of that still said that I was that. And so, I don't doubt where I came from. I don't question it. It's a part of my testimony. It's a part of who I am. But I also believe that where we start isn't where we have to finish. And I believe that, part of what the culture of America is that you can literally come from anywhere and you can become a better person. And so I'd like to think that that's part of my daily quest. And a part of that is right now, to remain silent in the face of evil is evil itself. And I won't do that.
Now, some of the picture that was painted was, well, this was a new change in lifestyle for you. When you got into politics, that's when your transformation and your rejection of that lifestyle took place long before that happened. Why don't you give us an idea of how did you break free, and what was you've told me about a conversation that you heard at the kitchen table between your grandfather, and because you were raised by your grandparents, and several leaders of this movement. Why don't you kind of go into that conversation and how that, quite frankly, was a day that you, well, spoke out for the first time?
So I was 14 years old, and as a 14-year-old, I didn't know a lot about the world. But I was making a sandwich in the kitchen while my grandfather and his friends were at the dining room table, which was just across the room. And they had maps and booklets and different things of the Northwest spread across the table. And they were talking about how they were going to implement their grand plan to take over the region. And that when they did, that everyone who disagreed with them was going to have their day. And what they described is that hanging from telephone poles, hanging from light poles, there'd be the Jewish bankers, there'd be the Mexicans that were trying to steal our women, there'd be black folks there, and right beside them, they said, would be the Judeo-Christian ministers who had let all of this happen. And somehow when I heard this stuff going on, I mean, it's not like it was unusual to hear that kind of stuff in the house, but that day, it just struck me as so viscerally wrong that there were, it was my grandfather and maybe 3 or 4, maybe half a dozen people, and I just had to speak up. And so I started arguing with each one of them, and I used the Bible and I used founding father quotes, and honestly, I don't even know where half of what I said came from. But by the end of it, they were red-faced and spitting, but they really couldn't refute what I had to say. And I realized that this wasn't the place for me anymore. And so
At 14.
At 14. And so I started looking for a way out. I was homeschooled at 14, raised in a culture that said that you couldn't trust anybody on the outside world. And so that didn't leave a lot of options. But thankfully, maybe thankfully is the wrong thing to say, but my grandmother was being abused by my grandfather at the time, and she had friends here in Northeast Washington that told her that if it ever got bad, that she had a safe place she could come to. So I started I would come with her. She'd go for like long weekends, and I came to regard Northeast Washington as like this safe place. So when I finally got a driver's license, got the means, got the capacity, I found a job on a cattle ranch here in Northeast Washington and came here thinking that I was going to make a new start. Imagine my surprise when after I got settled in here and I found out that people with very similar views to my grandfather lived here too. So, in all honesty, this journey for me has been one of faith, because when you're raised in this kind of environment with this kind of warped worldview, I think that's a God-sized problem. And it's honestly my faith, my walk with Christ, that has been a process of transformation. So it's not like at 14 that automatically all of that garbage was washed off of me. It's not like at 17 when I moved here that, suddenly miraculously my mind had been changed. It's obviously been a process. But definitely at 14 is when I recognized that this was not for me.
You mentioned your faith. The sad part about this is this particular movement, which dates back decades, this isn't new, folks. I have been studying this. I have seen this my entire career, 28 years. I've seen it ebb and flow. I've seen it at high water marks, which would be the bombings of the federal building in Kansas City. I've seen it at its lows. I'm seeing it at a spike again. This last week, 2 weeks ago, the Target in the Valley was plastered by the KKK, windshields with their literature. And the KKK is trying to use us, law enforcement now. They're trying to use our brand of the blue line as basically saying we support law enforcement. And I'm going to tell you right now, for all you KKK members out there and all you white supremacists out there that want to co-opt law enforcement in this region, not happening. Matter of fact, we will stand against you at every turn and every possibility. We have put many of you in prison, and I intend to put many more of you in prison if you break the law. This is unacceptable. This type of lifestyle will not be tolerated in Spokane County. You can say and do what you want, but if you cross the line into hurting people, or if you cross the line into wanting to blow up a third of the downtown area of Spokane, and yes, folks, these things have happened. These were the plots. We will do our best to stop you. So this is active. This is ongoing. And people ask me why, Sheriff, why do you think that the white supremacists are trying to infiltrate, this time it's the Republican Party, because, folks, the Democratic Party has their own history. They were the history of hate back in the 60s and back further than that. The Republican Party was the party of the civil rights movement. So it ebbs and flows. It's changed sides. It's morphed. And the reason that both the white supremacists and the anarchists / more nefariously now Antifa feel comfortable trying to infiltrate the left, the Democrats, is because we're both sides speaking nothing but pure hate. It takes hate in the environment, in the general overall environment, for this type of activity to spike. They can feel it. And folks, you can feel it too. I know. I've talked to many of you. You feel just how much and how widely we're divided as a nation. You feel and you talk about it, and you're sensing something. Well, what you're sensing is a rise in radicalized hate on both sides of the coin, right? And it takes that radicalized hate to cause this type of destruction. These people kill people. John, you know that. Yep. This movement, as much as my faith is important to me, your faith is important to you, this movement feeds upon our very faith, because they use our faith and warp it and transform it. This is based on the Christian identity movement. It goes way back.
Right.
These people have killed people. You mentioned 3 prominent names over and over in our discussions, and I have people that send me stuff all the time, folks. And these 3 names keep popping up in all the stuff across all the literatures that I've read and everything else. And then there are 2 names prominently in this area that have actually formed their own refuge, if you will, in Stevens County. And we're going to talk about all of it. So, John, how do they manage to drag the faith and use Christ in this? Because that is a key point that I found in all their literature.
So, I guess maybe an easier way to kind of define how you get in there is to tell my grandfather's story a little bit. Okay. I mean, my grandfather started out, hardworking. His parents were Russian-German immigrants. They were hardcore Lutherans. I mean, they left communist Russia to come to America so that they could worship God. So faith was an intimate part of their worldview. But they were also kind of outsiders, because they were the last immigrants to come across, in the early 20th century. So they got the lowest jobs. They got treated poorly. They were kind of disadvantaged and forced into kind of their own separate little communities. But what really happened, the catalyst in my grandfather's life, was he had a string of bad luck. He lost his job, he lost his house in a fire. He was forced to take what he considered a really demeaning job, which made him feel even worse. And while he was struggling with these feelings of shame and fear and what the future is going to hold and feeling like an outsider, he was targeted by neo-Nazis in southern Idaho. And what they gave him is in his world that was falling apart, that didn't make any sense, they gave him a worldview that kept him from taking responsibility for the mistakes that he had made and allowed him to place all of the blame for the bad things in his life in a single place. So they came in and they explained that the reason for all of his hardship were international Jewish bankers. And so this is the key that I think people on both the right and the left need to understand. The core of the Northwest's white supremacy is anti-Semitism. And so I have, friends from the left ask me, well, why is it that white supremacists don't try to infiltrate the left? Well, they do. They just use different talking points. For the left, they're using anti-Semitic BDS rhetoric. For the right, they're using this warped Christian identity perspective. But when it comes down to it, like you said, it's both. They're identifying hate, they're identifying fear, they're identifying broken people, and they're giving them an explanation of the world that allows them to place all their fear, all their blame at the feet of a single group of people. So in the philosophy that my grandfather received, it was the international Jewish bankers that were the reason he lost his job. Well, the owner of the bowling alley he worked at, he was a Jew, so he must be a part of it. And so by extension, anybody with any Jewish blood must be connected to this international Jewish conspiracy. And according to their narrative, the international Jews were using all of the brown-skinned folk in the world to damage and to do harm to white people. So for my grandfather, he already felt like an outsider. He already felt disadvantaged. He already felt like he was, somehow, on the bad side of things. And so the white supremacist just stepped in and answered his fears, answered his shame, and gave him a way that he felt special. Because now he had this special knowledge of the way that the world worked that very few people had. And so guys like Richard Butler with the Aryan Nations, they made him feel important. They told him, oh, hey, John, I don't care if you deliver newspapers. You're a great guy because you have our knowledge. You're going to carry our message. You're going to help us bring about our plans to have a Northwest that's whites only. So we felt special.
You mentioned something just right there. White-only Northwest. Again, folks, my entire career, I have listened to the same rhetoric that, and it contracts and expands, but at its zenith, if you will, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, it's going to be a white homeland. That's their vision. That is exactly how the vision goes. But in order to get there, they have to spread the ideology of how we get there. With the blame, Lord, let's not take any responsibility for our own actions. It's all everybody else's fault. And that is a tactic of theirs. When they get in trouble, folks, they start blaming everybody.
Right.
It's never them. I mean, take a look at Northwest Grassroots right now. That movement is blaming the world for their problems. They're blaming the world for, they've come up with this conspiracy theory that a mole was sent to the Northwest Grassroots meeting to tape the ALSEP conversation and then break it to the media. And I'm going, wait, time out. You filmed it yourself. You posted it on YouTube. You did. The leader, John Charleston of that group, posted that on YouTube. They were warned not to do this. They were warned this is a bad idea. Matter of fact, a month prior, and if you listen to that tape, the full conversation of that meeting, there's a lady that asked a question of the leadership going, time out. Didn't Kathy McMorris's representatives come to Cecily and say, Alsop is a bad guy. We do not associate with Alsop. He is a white supremacist, white nationalist, to have nothing to do with him. Didn't Kathy McMorris's team come and tell us not to do this? And it wasn't as if, folks, that she was chewing them out. It was basically, they were chewing Kathy's team out for daring to step up and talk against this movement, talk against Mr. Alsop. You didn't see that in the local media. You didn't read that in any papers, that there was actually that conversation at that meeting, that the establishment, if you will, of the GOP went, this is bad, this is a bad guy, do not associate. Because we still have great people in both sides of these parties. Both sides have great people, but we're allowing extremists to drag us down. And it's a shame. It really is. It's a shame. It bothers me. We haven't even scratched the surface. This was just kind of the introduction, folks. We're doing 2, maybe 3 segments on this. So those of you who are watching the Facebook side of it, you're going to get the whole story all at once. Those who watch the podcast, you'll see section 1, 2, and 3. And those who listen to AM 630 ACN on Saturdays at noon, you'll get this throughout the next 3 weeks. So I hope I covered that well enough. You know, John, when we come back, because I'm getting the 2-minute mark, when we come back, let's talk about the Christian identity movement a little. The 3 names that are surfaced throughout this whole thing, and then let's tie it into Marble Country up in Stevens County and the leadership there. And then let's talk about how that leadership has influenced the politics kind of the region. That's where we're going, folks. We're going to outline just how this movement has taken hold, and it has taken hold. It is deeply rooted right now. And it is time, if we are ever going to break the back of this movement, if we're ever going to say enough is enough, this is the time. And John shortly will give you an idea of some of the terminology, as in agents of Satan, and what that actually means, quite frankly, to you and I.
Right.
It is going to be a little shocking once you figure you hear what that terminology is, what the terminologies of the sons of God actually truly means. This is a, I hate to say it, folks, this is a really deep-rooted system. Their whole goal, as John will cover, is to take over local governments. You saw that attempt in Harney County, Oregon, when they tried to take over or took over that wildlife refuge. If you remember, I had Sheriff Ward on this program. Sheriff Ward made it very clear to me, Ozzie, if they get away with it, there will be no small community that is safe in the United States. Those are his words. And folks, I believe it. The things they did down in Harney County, the things they did to Sheriff Ward's family, his elderly parents, are things that you've seen all your life. This movement is very nefarious. This movement can be deadly. They have killed people. So John, in the next minute, kind of outline just a little bit about how your knowledge of Marble came to be.
So again, like I said, I grew up with my grandparents living in southern Idaho. My grandfather, after he had initially connected with the Dick Butlers of the world, he also became kind of affiliated with Christian identity teachers that were all over the country at the time. And he attended a small group of Christian identity folks, and they would hold like annual, because the Christian identity followers don't really have a centralized head, they would kind of revolve from camp to camp or from group meeting to group meeting, and so people from all over the country would come to a specific meeting at a specific time. They'd have their speakers, and then they'd all go home again. So in my childhood, so probably when we're talking 3rd, 4th grade, the group that my grandfather belonged there began having once-a-year conferences, and people from all over the country came. And 2 of the people that came were Barry and Ann Bird from up here in Northeast Washington. And they were very much involved in the culture of what was going on. They were very much involved in the conversations, about the Christian identity talking points, that the Jews were in control of the world, that a part of the problem was this interracial marriage business, and we really just needed to have our Christian culture, not a culture that included them. And so that's where I initially met the birds, or that was one of my first glimpses into what was here. But I had no idea I guess the clout that they had. I mean, people live all over the country. I had no idea the connections that they had. So later, when I eventually moved here, some of the birds' associates, I was 17 years old, still a minor, couldn't even vote, and they came to me and they told me that that Marble had been established to implement this grand plan that Pete Peters and Jack Moore and others had been talking about, and that this was my opportunity to be a part of the kingdom of God. And if I came and joined up and took part in their community, then I'd gain access to God, and I'd have this close family of believers, like-minded believers, and we'd bring about the kingdom because, a part of that plan that they were trying to initiate is they believed that the world was controlled by this group of global Jewish bankers, and the way that they were going to end that was ultimately through a civil war that was facilitated by a slow takeover of county government.
And folks, we're going to wrap the first section of this conversation right there, because when we come back, we will step into the further discussion of the takeover of local governments. And we are seeing that. We are seeing that right here, right now, in Spokane County. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. I hope that you find this interesting. Again, those of you who are watching this live through Facebook, stay tuned. We're going to just continue down. And those of you who are going to listen to other methods, there'll be one, maybe two more segments to follow. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
The Sheriff's Report is a joint production of Spokane Talks Media and KTW 630 AM and 96.5 FM, which are solely responsible for its content. Ask a question, recommend a guest, or watch this program again anytime at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. Have a safe day.